Hey, this is Jesse Tula for BetchFrame.com and CreativeCow.net, and in this tutorial I'm going to be going through how to create your own pseudo effects for After Effects. Now, a couple things before I get started. One, pseudo effects are not normal effects. They're not going to show up in the effects menu. They won't be in here. Pseudo effects are only for presets and making them look more professional and more organized. So let's look at the problem. If we take this quick gravity preset from my site and drop it on, you can see it's just like a standard preset where we have these 6 separated controls. Some are sliders, some are checkboxes. You could have more by going up to the expression controls and using any of these controls. And all of them work together to create the quick gravity effect. However, everything is kind of unorganized. It's messy. You have to open each one up separately to see its value. And a big thing is that if you hit the reset button, it doesn't go to the default that I set, it goes to the default of the slider, which is 0, or the default of the checkbox, which is unchecked. So, all of these things can be fixed by using pseudo effects. And a pseudo effect looks something like this. You can see that at the top here, we have the name of our preset, which is already an advantage over the normal style, because by looking at this, you might not know that this is a preset at all. It sort of just looks like 6 different effects. Here you can see that it's all grouped into one effect with a name, so we know what it is. And we have all of our controls nice and organized. You can see each of them. You can hide ones that aren't as important as the other controls. We have an on-off switch that doesn't have the stopwatch, so you can't keyframe it. And you can see back here that the on-off switch can be keyframed, which is not something I wanted. So all of our problems can be fixed in here, and if we change any of these values and hit the reset button, they all go back to the defaults that I set, not to the defaults of the controls themselves. So let's see how you can create these. Now you should know before we get started that these controls are not created inside of After Effects. They're created using some XML in a separate file. And if you're not comfortable doing that kind of programming, at the end of this tutorial I'll be going through a very user-friendly and simple way to do this without having to write any code by hand. But for those of you who do want to learn, let's get started. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to open up our preseteffects.xml file. And if you don't know where to find that, you're going to go into Program Files, Adobe, your version of After Effects, Support Files, and scrub down to the preseteffects.xml. And if you're working on a Mac, what you're going to do is you're going to go into the Applications folder, into your version of After Effects, right-click on the application file and go to Show Package Contents, into the Contents folder, into Resources, and then down to preseteffects.xml. And we'll open that up in any text editor. I'm using Notepad++, but you can use anything you want that reads XML files. They all work the same. So here you can see that I have the quick gravity and the custom control that we'll be looking at later on over here. But you won't have those two. But if we scrub to the top of this file, you can see that at the top we have a bunch of definitions of the different controls that we can use, and if you forget any of the options that we'll be talking about, you can always come up here and see all of the options that are available for that control. Now it's interesting that I'm highlighting this one because this control, the pop-up control, is actually something that's no longer or has never been supported in After Effects. So if you've been wondering about that, from the research that I've done, I've found that it's something that is not supported in After Effects. But for these other controls, you can come up here and you can see different options that you have for each of them. So let's scroll to the bottom and get started with our first pseudo effect. Okay, so to start your effect, the first thing we want to do is open our effect tag. Now let's talk about tags real quick. There's two types in this file. There's one type where you open a tag and then a couple lines down you'll close it, and there's the tag that opens and closes on the same line. This / and greater than sign, that's a closing. This is also a type of closing, so there's two different types of tags. The effect is one of those tags that opens and closes on two separate lines. So we'll start out by typing in the less than symbol, capital E for effect, and be aware that everything in this entire file that's not in quotes is case sensitive. So make sure you're spelling everything correctly, or when you apply your pseudo effect, you're going to run into some errors. And if you do run into any errors later on, the first thing you should check is that everything is spelled right, everything is properly capitalized, and most likely that'll be the problem you have. So after we open this effect, the first option that we have is the match name. Well, what's a match name? Let's go back into After Effects, and I'm just going to duplicate this effect, and I'm going to change the name. So the name is now changed. Now what if you had an expression or a script that used that name? Well, now it's changed, so there's no way of knowing that this was originally a quick gravity preset. Well, that's where this match name comes into play. Even though the name was changed, the match name stays the same. So by setting this match name, you're giving After Effects a way to track this effect without the user having to leave the name the same. This match name will always be whatever we set it to and cannot be changed by the user. So match names can have spaces. They don't have to have this underscore. If you have spaces, if you look at some of the Adobe ones, you can see everything will work perfectly fine. It's just up to you on how you like to name them. So we'll put this as tutorial control, and that's our match name. Okay, so now let's create our name. Now this is the part that's going to be actually displayed, and it's changeable by the user. Now if you look at these previous controls, you can see that they all start with this path. Now from all of the research that I've done, and I've done many hours trying to find something on what exactly this is referring to, I found absolutely nothing. However, what I do know is that you have to have it there in order for your names to be displayed correctly. For instance, if you had something like this, the name would show up as custom control equals custom control. But when you have this, the name simply shows up as custom control without any of this preceding stuff. So we're going to keep our control with that same scheme. We'll put name is equal to, then we'll type in our name, and I would stay away from spaces in this part before the equal sign. Then we'll put the equal sign and the name that we want to be displayed. And it can be whatever you'd like. That's the name that's going to show up right here. And that's it for the first part of the effect tag. We'll close it with a greater than symbol. And then I'm going to return once, and I'm going to close the effect tag just so I don't forget later on. And all of our controls are going to go between these two tags. So the first control we're going to be talking about is the angle control. And we're just going to be going in alphabetical order. And the way to start a control is to open it up with a capital letter, so capital A for angle. And the first option we're going to put in is the name option, followed by an equal sign and double quotes. And inside those quotes, we're going to put our standard path. Then we're going to put in its name, which I'm just going to have as angle, followed by the equal sign. And then after the equal sign, just like before, is the name that we want to be displayed next to the control. So whatever you want to be displayed here, for instance this was amplitude or frequency or decay, that's the name that you're going to put after the equal sign. So I'm just going to call this angle with a capital A, but you can put whatever you'd like. And this control has a couple of options, the first being default. So what do you want your default angle to be? Well, you could have it be 0, you could have it be 90, you could have it be whatever you want. If you want it to be something, for instance, you want it to be something past 360 degrees, like 2 times 119, well, the way you do that is by simply typing in its equivalent without having the 2 times. So 2 times is referring to 2 times 360 plus 119, which is equal to 839. So if you wanted this control to have a default of 2 times 119, you would put in 839, which gives you 2 times 119. So that's how you set defaults for an angle control. And that's the only option that is required for the angle control. However, there's an optional option, which is cannot time vary. And you can see that it's all uppercase letters and the words are separated by underscores. And we're going to set this equal to true, and that's inside of quotes. Now, if you have this cannot time vary option selected, the stopwatch will not be visible in After Effects, which means that the user can't set keyframes for that particular control. So if you don't want the user to be able to set keyframes, set the cannot time vary to true. You can also set this to false, and then the stopwatch will be there. However, this is by default false. So if you want there to be a stopwatch, just don't put that option at all. Now if we scrub back up to the top, you can see that this angle control also has this last option called external ID. However, it's implied, which means that we don't have to worry about it. The only ones we have to worry about are the ones that are required, and if we'd like, the optional controls. Back to the bottom. This is now a complete control, and to close it up, we're going to put a / and a greater than sign, and that will close our angle control. So the next one we're going to be talking about is the checkbox control, which is another simple one. So we'll open it up, capital checkbox, and for its name, just like before, we'll put in that path, and we'll put in checkbox, an equal sign, and then the name we want displayed. And this time the default is a Boolean, which means it's either true or false. So default, if we want it to be checked by default, type in true. If you want it to be unchecked by default, put in false. And just like the angle control, you can also have the cannot time vary option. And you always have that set to true, otherwise don't put it at all. And then you can close up your control. And that's it for the checkbox control. Next on the list is our color control. Now this one, it starts to get a little bit more tricky. So color, capital C, name, just as the others, put our path followed by the name, and the name we want shown. Now, the previous two have had a single default. You can see this one's default is 839, this one's default is false. Well, the color control has 3 defaults, a default red, a default green, and a default blue. And that allows you to set the color that you want. So to choose your color, the easiest way to do it is go into After Effects, go into one of these controls, and choose the color that you like. And then if you look down here at the bottom right, you can see we have an R, a G, and a B value. And these are the values that you can use in your control. So let's first set our default red, which is 30. So default red equals 30. Next will be our default green. And the green is equal to 94. And last is our default blue. And that is equal to 130. So by setting these 3 defaults, we'll get the color that we're looking for. And the only other option for this color control is the cannot time vary one. So you can also allow or not allow the user to keyframe the color. Once you're done, we're going to close it up, and we'll move on to the next control, which is the layer control. So let's take a look at this. Pretty simple control, just has a selection of any layers that are in the composition. So we'll start out just like the rest of them, capital L for layer, followed by the name, the path, and the name we want displayed, and its default. Now, the default for this one is a little bit different. You don't just put default, you put default self. And this is either set to true or false. And what this option gives you is, do you want this layer control to automatically be set to the layer itself, or do you want it to be set to none? So false is none, true is whatever layer has this control, that's the layer that's going to be selected automatically. And that's the only option for the layer control. This does not have the cannot time vary, because if you look, the layer control never has a stopwatch. So you can never set keyframes for the layer control, so it doesn't have that option. So we can close this up and move on to our next control, which is the point control. As always, set its name. Okay, so the point control, the defaults are set a little bit differently than the other controls. This one has a default X and a default Y. And these numbers that you put here, so for instance, if you put 100 here and 100 here, you might expect that your point values would be 100 and 100, but that's not the way it works. Let's say you wanted your point to show up directly in the middle, which would be, in this case, 960 by 540. Well, the way you would do that is by going in here and putting in 0.5 and 0.5. So these values are not what's going to show up here, it's relative values to the layer. So what it's saying is you want to be halfway in the Y and halfway in the X. So 0.5, 0.5 will give you, in this case, 960 by 540. And if the layer was a different size, it would give you whatever the halfway point is for the X and the Y for that layer. Now this point control can also have the cannot time vary option if you'd like, but once you're done, we're just going to close this off and move on to our last control, which is the slider control. Now the slider control has more options than the other controls. If we take a look at this basic slider here, you can see it has a default, a slider min, a slider max, and if we go into this edit value, you can see that it also has a value range. So it has a valid min and a valid max. So 5 options that we need to set for our slider control to be valid. So first the name, and we'll just put it in like always. We'll have our default, and I'll just set this to 10. Our slider min, so whatever we want our slider's minimum value to be. We'll set this to -50. Slider max, I don't know, 90. These are just random values, you can make them whatever you'd like. Then we have our valid min, which I'll make -2000, and our valid max, which I'll make 5000. Now the only thing you need to be aware of here is that your values make sense. For instance, you don't want your slider min to be less than your valid min, or else you're going to get an error because the slider min can't be less than the valid min. And this goes the same for the slider max being greater than the valid max. You can actually have your default be greater than the slider max. For instance, default of 100, this would still be a valid control. However, it doesn't really make too much sense. So just think about the values you're putting in and make sure they all work together. So we can close this off, and this is a valid slider control. But there are a couple more options that we can put into this slider. The first is precision. And what this allows us to do is set the number of digits that come after the decimal point in our slider. So for instance, if we go into After Effects, you can see here that I have a slider with a precision of 5. And you can see that there are 5 zeros after the decimal point. And to do that, we would just put in a precision of 5. If you wanted 2 numbers after, just put in a 2. If you wanted 1 digit after, you'd put in a 1. However, the default of precision is 1, so if you're going to do this, you might as well leave it out completely. We'll just leave it at 2. And that's precision. The next option is display percent. And this is like the cannot time vary, where by default it's set to false, or you can set it to true. So if you don't want it to display percent, you can just leave this control out completely because display percent is by default set to false. But here it's set to true, and what this is going to do is show this percent sign next to your value. Now one thing to be aware of is that this percent sign is only for display purposes. What I mean by that is, let's say you have 1%. In math, 1% is equal to 0.01. After Effects does not make that conversion. To After Effects, this is still just seen as 1. The percent sign is only there to let the user know that they are setting a percent in your control, but the value itself is still just 1. So be aware of that. And the next option we have is Display Pixel. Now this one seems to be not fully supported in After Effects, and I'll show you what I mean. Down here at the bottom, you can see that we have this one, Display Pixel, and you can see that its values are larger than the defaults. So this is negative 25500 and positive 25500. And if we go into the project and change it from 8 bits per channel to 16 bits per channel, you can see that these values have become even larger. Now the reason I'm saying it's not fully supported is because if we change it to 32 bits per channel, it goes back to just the negative 100 and 100. Now this may be because those values would just be way too large, but it does seem like it's not fully supported. But if you can find a use for that, that's what the Display Pixel does. So I'll get rid of that, and the only control left for this slider is the cannot time vary. So if you don't want your user to be able to keyframe your slider, you can throw that in there too. Okay, so that's all the controls we have for our pseudo effects. The last thing we can add is groups. And you can see back in the quick gravity that this right here, the optional controls group, just contains 2 other controls. So groups are just for organizational purposes, nothing else. Groups can contain as many controls as you want. They can contain other groups, but they're all just there for organizational purposes. So to create a group, what you're going to do is surround a set of controls by a group tag. So we'll start it on one line. Type in capital G group, name, and we'll set the name as group, just like always. And we'll close this up. Make sure you don't put the / here, because this time we're going to be closing the group on a separate line. Now I'm going to tab in the controls that we're going to be putting inside the group, just so you can keep them separate and see easily that they're inside of something else. And then we'll close the group just like that. And it's as simple as that to create a group. So now we've gone over everything that there is inside of the preset effects.xml. You can get way more complicated than this. You can have several more of each type of control. You can have several groups. But this is everything that you can do as simple as possible inside the preset effects.xml. So now let's take a look at how you can bring your control into After Effects. So to do that, what we're going to have to do is save this file. And we have to close and reopen After Effects. That's the only way for it to recognize the new effect inside your preset effects.xml. Okay, so once you have After Effects open, I'm just going to open this project back up. And I'm just going to create a new composition. And we'll add a layer to put our effect onto. And then we're going to go into the script editor. So File, Scripts, Open Script Editor. And we're just going to write a very simple script to apply our effect. So we're going to type in app.project, and this is all lowercase, .active item is capitalized, item, .layer, followed by parentheses, and 1, so the first layer, .effect, .add, capital P for property, and in parentheses, in quotes, we're going to put the match name for our control. And we'll run this, and And the script has been run. Go back into After Effects and into the Effect Controls panel, and you can see the control that we created. We have our angle, our checkbox, our color. The checkbox doesn't have a stopwatch because we turned off the stopwatch. And inside our group, we have 3 more controls. And although it takes some time, it's pretty simple to create your own controls. Then you can come in here, you can set your expressions, and then when you want to create your preset, simply take this and drag it in to the preset and effects panel. Now, a little issue that you may have experienced in the past is that sometimes controls have missing preceding the name, and I'll show you why that is. Let me close out of After Effects real quick after saving. And I'm going to delete the control that we just created. Save our preset effects file and open After Effects back up. Okay, now when we just saved this project, we were using that tutorial control. And you can see now I'm getting an error that says we're missing it. And if we go into the layer itself, you can see it now says missing tutorial control. So the reason for that is because the control itself is no longer in our preseteffects.xml file. So if you've ever downloaded some pseudo effects from a website, that's the reason for the missing. Now, you should know that everything will still work perfectly fine, but there's no way to get rid of that missing. Even if you delete it and change the name, it's still going to add that missing right back in front. But everything will still work the same. The only way to get rid of it is to add that control to your XML file. Okay, now that's all there is on writing these pseudo effects. Now, for those of you who aren't too comfortable doing this type of stuff, or who just don't want to spend the time doing all the error checking to make sure that you don't have any spelling mistakes, there's a simpler way to do it. Go to your web browser and go to batchframe.com/custom controls. And here I have created a custom expression controls creator where over on the right we have a little example of what ours is going to look like. We can set the name, and you can see it displayed over here, so you get a slight idea of what you're creating. And you can simply create all of your controls, set the values, set the names, and it's all displayed over on the right. You can close it up just to keep things a little bit simpler while you're working. You can move up and down with these arrow controls. You can also click and just drag them to change the order, and everything is displayed over here. Now, you should know that this is not a completely accurate display. For instance, creating groups shows up like this. It won't tab in like it does in After Effects, but for the most part you do get an idea of what your control is going to look for. Now, once you get a control that you're happy with, hit get the code, and it writes all of the code for you. You can simply copy this, paste it into your XML file, and it even gives you the JavaScript that you can paste in here to add your control to the first layer. And that makes it even simpler to create your own pseudo effects for After Effects. So use this tool to save you some time. But that's it for this tutorial. I hope you learned something. I hope that you can find these pseudo effects useful, and just to keep things a little bit more professional looking and more organized. Once again, I am Jesse Tula from batchframe.com. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.